The Philip Schofield story rumbles on, partly because GB News and Dan Wootton particularly cannot let the thing go. And they want to keep it as personal as possible. I think they're wrong. I think the story is about the production. But what's interesting is even while they're trying to target and hammer Philip Schofield, the nails are being driven into the producers at the same time. And so long may it continue, because, this needs to be aired. And ultimately, I think the real culprit will be the DCMS, the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, these particularly inane and lazy MPs, starting with Oliver Dowden, now the Conservative chairman, then Nadine Dorries, famously indolent, then Michelle Donnellan. Who is she, you may ask? Indeed. And finally Lucy Fraser, who's hardly opened her mouth in office. And all of them, well, Nadine Dorries has been only too vocal, but she's not got office anymore. Why has Liz Fraser kept so quiet? Because she's got nothing to say. I mean, it doesn't seem to be a very long journey from ear to ear when it comes to Miss Fraser and her actual job. I'm sure she's got plenty to say about other stuff, about defending Boris, defending Rishi, making comments about the Home Office. Well, maybe that's her ambition. But it seems fairly evident she has no interest in the arts. And we need to have somebody with an interest in the arts who's aware of the role that the arts play in our life. The arts are terribly important, as indeed they are throughout the world. As indeed the failure to grip the extraordinary domestic propaganda which is going across Russia to defend the Kremlin's war against Ukraine, this is something that will bite us in the backside because we have failed to deal with it. Stephen Rosenberg, I'm sure, is only too well aware. And the rest of us think that, or the rest of the government think that as long as it provides missiles to Ukraine, it's doing its job. We have a much better job that we can do, and we are not doing it, which is to counter this propaganda. We think propaganda is only dangerous if it's directed to us. No. This propaganda is infecting an entire nation, which is being educated to hate the West, and it's wrong. It's absurd. Carol mcgiffin was being interviewed by Dan Wootton yesterday on GB News, and she talked about the rumour mill on loose women and how suddenly the fellow who had been in a relationship with Philip Schofield was transferred from this morning onto loose women. And at the same time, the runner who had been working on loose women, a fellow called Mitch, in 2019 suddenly disappeared. And this new fellow said, I'm the new production secretary. He had a new title, but he was doing the same job. She said that he seemed a bit troubled. He was in a bit of a bad way, a lot of issues. And many of the loose women on the panel felt very parental. They tried to comfort him. They're empathetic people, she said, who took him under their wing. Everybody knew, she said, something was wrong. Everybody knew, but no one confirmed the rumour. Now, she thinks that Philip has taken the hit. Philip is covering for everybody else. He has taken that hit. It was engineered, she says. I think that's a very interesting way of looking at it. But then she goes on, she can't stop it really. I mean, she was clearly very upset that Loose Women was dealing with Schofield's mess. Dealing with the mess that he'd created with his relationship with somebody who had been a runner and who was also referred to as Philip's PA. And then ITV claimed that he'd been given a promotion. He'd become production secretary. Well, production secretary is just a name. It's not a promotion. Suddenly, Suddenly, after a short period, he went off to Manchester and they haven't heard from him again. She thought that he was going through a sort of breakdown. But she was very clear, as was Eamon Holmes. Eamon Holmes called it an unprecedented move to go from This Morning to Loose Women. No one could have moved from one programme to another without the approval of senior management. So for them to deny responsibility, for them to say, oh, not my fault, mate. She says her beef is with management. Phillip is covering for them. She said it more than once. She was making a very clear statement that he was trying to take the fall for them all. She said most TV bosses, we can be sure, think that they are invincible, think that everything will be okay once there's been an apology, once somebody has been set up to take the fall. And Phillip was a very good target. Phillip looks arrogant. Actually, when you look at him, he looks as if he's aged overnight. If you look at that Sun BBC interview, my goodness, he suddenly looks 61, I think. He says, I didn't groom him. There is no question I did a bad thing. And then it cuts back to Carol McGiffin saying, well, absolutely he did a bad thing. He messed around with this young man's life. But the point that she doesn't say is so does production. That is what production does. That's what reality TV does. That's what these sofa series do. They mess around with people's lives because they're interested in putting drama on stage, on screen as fast as possible. She then, every other minute she went back to the fact that she clearly doesn't like Phillip. But I think that isn't the issue. In fact, she said that I think there's only one person on Loose Women who liked Phillip. She said she didn't know who that was. And people were very reluctant to like Phillip. And there was talk at the end of that interview about how Phillip signed off, or how Loose Women signed off and passed on to This Morning, and how Phillip was often quite rude, and was particularly rude with Ruth. And Ruth made a specific allegation and a complaint against him. Nobody ever had a good word for him, she said. But we get back to that main point, and the main point of her interview is that Phillip is the fall guy for production, and that a decision has been made, and Phillip, I think her suggestion is that a deal has been done, and maybe Phillip felt that he had that it was time for him to retire. I don't think Phillip realised just how difficult this is going to be. Maybe he was presented with a fait accompli, but I don't think it's going to work, because I think people have seen through it. Whatever you think about Philip Schofield, I don't think that much about Philip Schofield as a TV presenter. I thought he was wonderful as the musical star of Dr. Dolittle. Genuinely wonderful. I thought he was a tremendous theatre asset. But as a boffin on television, I'm not particularly fazed. I don't think I've really watched him very much. He doesn't command my interest on television at all. But I think this story goes to the heart of the whole Caroline Flack, Jeremy Kyle issue, which should have been dealt with in 2019. It wasn't, and that's the fault of the Secretary of State for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, who didn't reconvene the committee to continue looking into the problem of the manipulation of production. And indeed, production is now legitimately more manipulative than it was beforehand. It's production that controls psychological support for people after they've been on these television programs. Production, and producers. And why? Because it was producers who had testified at the committee, and almost no ordinary people, no performers, no, quote, contestants had testified. 4 of them. 4 of them, after months of testimony. Most of that was production staff and producers. So why are we not surprised that the actual report is biased in favour of production, and that is the rubbish which is championed by Ofcom? And if you contact the DCMS, or if you contact the whatever second-rate figurehead is up there as Secretary of State for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, you don't get a reply. You get Julia Lopez saying, talk to Ofcom. And Ofcom writes back or telephones and says, well, we have nothing to do with it. We're in a vicious circle where nobody wants to take responsibility, and meanwhile people are hurt. And the list of people from reality TV particularly who have killed themselves is astonishingly high. And this government doesn't seem to care. And this government had every opportunity of leading the world in changing the nature of television. And it ducked its responsibility. It ducked its option. It avoided it. It's going to end up with egg on its face.